Eucatastrophe by A Real Sword. Chapter 1. Thomas. The day is clear and clean and bright, and Thomas is out in the forest just a few miles away from his house. It's always a bit of a trip to get there in the first place, of course, but that's a small price to pay for the simple, organic beauty of it all. Thomas loves his job, and loves his friends, and loves the town he lives in, but sometimes it's nice to just get away from all that, to hike out to the local forest and spend some time wandering through the seemingly endless tall trees and the patches of gloriously warm golden sunlight filtering in through their branches, alone. Well, mostly alone. It had just been Roman who'd shown up at first, during the car trip over. Not an unusual occurrence when he's out and about and his mind's wandering, and Thomas had been more than happy for the company. Having someone to bounce ideas and thoughts and dumb jokes off of is always more pleasant than being entirely alone, after all. And since puns and jokes were in the mix, it didn't take very long at all for Patton to show up as well, his tied-over-the-shoulders hoodie flapping in the wind as he jogged along beside Roman and Thomas, sometimes running ahead slightly so he could turn around and chat face-to-face with them as he walked rapidly backward. Upon reaching the forest itself, an old, endless sort of place with so many pine trees it seemed like something directly out of Gravity Falls than anywhere that should rightfully exist in the middle of Florida, Virgil had skulked out from behind a couple of shady trees, muttering something about the dangers of wandering alone through unknown forests, to which Thomas had reminded him that it wasn't unknown. He had been there several times previously, and besides, he wasn't really alone. He had 3 very good friends backing him up right now, didn't he? At that point, Logan had shown up too, looking very out of place amidst the trees with his immaculate shirt and neat tie, and had pointed out that actually there were 4 people backing Thomas up, even if all of them weren't strictly corporeal in any significantly helpful sense. Logan had also provided several gentle yet reasonable reassurances for Virgil's case of forest apprehension, and when Thomas had offered a hand out to him, he had taken it with only the slightest bit of hesitation. Patton had happily grabbed onto Virgil's other hand and tugged at Logan's sleeve until he did the same, and Roman had linked fingers with a grinning Thomas on his other side, and this is how they all got to how they are now, wandering through the trees together, chatting idly, and occasionally singing snippets of music at each other. All of them holding hands hadn't lasted very long at all, because the dirt path they're following is slightly too thin to accommodate 5 people walking side by side, so they're now walking in a loose group, Virgil still sticking close to Thomas and not letting go of his hand. Thomas doesn't mind. The slight buzz of anxious adrenaline that comes from Virgil making contact with him is only really shocking in the first moment it happens. Now it's just kind of comforting, like a slightly too cold blast from his car air conditioner on an extremely hot day, like his morning cup of coffee had just succeeded in kicking in. Hanging out with his sides like this, it's nice. Really nice, actually. There's no real urgency to anything that they're talking about, and when they do fall into brief periods of debating and argument, it's much lighter and far less dire than usual. Thomas feels warm as he looks around at all of them. Logan eagerly explaining the basics of forest soil acidity and alkalinity to a nodding, comically serious-looking Patton, who clearly has no idea what he's talking about. Roman wondering in Thomas's direction how hard it would be to coax a real bird over to sit on his finger so he can have a suitably charming Disney prince moment with it. Virgil with one earphone bud in, the music blasting from it loud enough that Thomas can make out the strains of some musical theater soundtrack he can't quite remember the name of. It's not what he'd consider Virgil's usual fare, but he seems content enough, so he doesn't bring it up, not even to gently tease him. About a half an hour into this, they're deep enough into the forest that any and all sounds of civilization are non-existent. They haven't passed any other people on the walking track, which isn't unusual as such. It's a pretty quiet forest in general. It's also probably a good thing, because the idea of having to explain to a complete stranger why he's talking with himself, or, well, multiple versions of himself, or even make awkward eye contact with them, isn't a fun thought in the least. Roman's humming and occasionally vocalizing snatches of music over his shoulder in Thomas's direction, to which Thomas is either nodding and humming back at him, or frowning and suggesting something else, because Roman's apparently working on a song of some sort for a video concept that Thomas has been considering for a while, when Thomas spots Janice, keeping pace with him several meters to the left of their group. Nobody else has seemed to notice yet, not even eternally vigilant Virgil, who's currently engaged in a remarkably thoughtful conversation with Patton about punk culture. When Thomas makes brief eye contact and raises a questioning eyebrow, Janus looks slightly uncomfortable for a moment or two before shrugging silently and indicating the others, all coexisting without argument. He presses a finger to his lips, then readjusts his hat as he looks up into the treetops, smiling at nothing in particular. He looks content to just enjoy the morning as much as everyone else without engaging or interacting or disturbing the equilibrium they've found, so Thomas decides to just let sleeping snakes lie, so to speak, and not say anything about it, choosing instead to look back to Roman and keep on throwing snippets of melody and snatches of lyrics back and forth with him. As it turns out, Logan has appropriate words and rhyme schemes to share, which only becomes apparent upon Patton encouraging him into doing so. Within less than 10 minutes of this, Thomas has his phone out, which he'd promised himself he wouldn't do during this walk, and is typing brief, typo-ridden dot points into his notes app and grinning to himself as ideas spring into existence around him. Eventually, his mind drifts away from songs and composition, and all of a sudden, everyone seems to be debating the merits of nectarines over peaches, something Thomas wasn't even aware he had an opinion on, but there's a pretty obvious divide here. Virgil keeps insisting that the mouthfeel of nectarines is immensely superior to peaches in every way, while Patton and Roman are both of the opinion that peaches are just tastier and sweeter in general, which is what's most important. "Come on, guys," Thomas says, breaking into their conversation. He's abruptly remembered a detour he had taken on a previous forest exploration trip. "I remember a great place, just up here." He leads their small party off the well-worn dirt path and toward the sound of running water, and before long they're all standing in front of a gushing, crystal-clear stream that's about thigh-deep, if Thomas is remembering correctly. Patton's almost immediately stripping off his shoes and paw-print-covered socks and rolling up his pant legs, because he's the sort of person that jumps into large bodies of water just because he can, but he also doesn't like having wet socks. Roman's wading off into the depths without bothering to take anything off, because he's the sort of person who's all too aware that he can magically, physically, imaginarily, whateverly, snap all the water away in an instant. "This is good," says Virgil. He sits on a rock just overhanging the river and looks around as Logan comes to sit next to him as well, smiling faintly. "It's weird, but this is actually okay. I mean, apart from the fact that the river could have a million weird water viruses in it, and also they could fall in and drown, or get ticks, or catch hypothermia. Come to think of it, you may be absolutely right," says Logan, raising an eyebrow. "If any of us besides Thomas were actually real, there might be a distinct chance of any of that happening." "No need to be sarcastic about it," Virgil replies, and sighs. "Sorry. It's kind of my job, so—" "Not a problem," Logan says, and awkwardly bumps shoulders with him, like he's unsure of what he's even doing. Thomas sits down, just at the edge of the river, and grins up at them both. "Don't worry, Virg, or don't worry about this, at least. I'm not planning on going in today." They watch Patton and Roman splashing around in the water for a while. It's a comfortable, sunny silence, broken only by soft, even footsteps from behind them. "Oh, great," mutters Virgil acidly, seeing that Janus has finally elected to join them. "Look who's here." Janus raised an eyebrow and looked around, exaggeratedly curious, left to right again. Someone else? Here?" Thomas is having a really good day, and he doesn't want it to be ruined by something as stupid as an argument with himself. Multiple himselfs. "All right, guys, play nice," he begs, breaking up the ensuing argument before it can really start to get going. "Please, just for today, get along." Virgil sighs and growls and glares, but eventually relents. Logan actually rolls his eyes a bit, and what's up with that? But he didn't seem to actually have had a problem in the first place. Patton and Roman haven't even noticed yet. "Absolutely not," sniffs Janus. "Thank you." Thomas, relieved, shuffles over to let Janus sit next to him on the riverbank. It takes a couple more minutes for something else to happen, and when it does, Thomas, as per goddamn usual, doesn't see or hear Remus coming. All that he knows is that one moment he's leaned up against the side of the rock that Virgil and Logan are perched on, about to ask something about birds or flowers that he hopes Logan remembers the answer to better than he ever could, and the next there's someone colliding heavily on him from behind, the weight toppling him forward so he ends up nearly toppling into the stream. He hears wholehearted laughter and the smell of something very slightly rotten, and twists around to see the other half of his creativity is clinging to his back like a demented, green, glittery koala. "Hey, Remus," Thomas sighs. "How's it going?" "Hi!" Remus chirps, apparently entirely delighted to be there. "Did you know that bull sharks can adapt to fresh water? There could be a shark coming down this stream to chop all our dangly bits off, even as we speak." Over Virgil's shriek of, "They what?" and Logan's mildly delighted, "As a matter of fact, I did." Thomas starts trying to gently disentangle Remus from him, because his back is protesting a bit from the unexpected weight, as imaginary as it is. Roman, from the water, lets out a shout of annoyed alarm and starts splashing his way to shore, pulling out his katana from his side as he does so. "Hey there, bro," Remus exclaims, and allows Thomas to dump him gently on the ground. "Ready for a wild, bloody fight to the death? I've been dreaming about this for weeks." "That is actually immensely disturbing now that you mention it," Roman says, halting in the shallows, "and it makes me more than a little reluctant to actually fight you like I was planning to. But if you don't depart now into the vile shadows from whence you came, I may be forced to do just that. Leave, or taste the steel of my blade, brother." "Sure thing," Remus exclaims, "although I'd really prefer to taste some other things, if you catch my drift." "Oh my God, you're disgusting," Virgil mutters under his breath. Remus grins a cheesy grin. Literally. There's literal cheese in it. It's pretty much as terrible as it sounds. "I aim to please, Paramoros." Patton's also made his way to shore. He looks like he's on the verge of tears as his eyes dart back and forth from Remus, attention-catching and bombastic, to Janice, who's been lurking on the edge of events, silently observing but not really engaging at all. Patton being on the verge of tears is never a good sign, so Thomas figures it's about time for him to step in. "Do we need to fight?" he says. "This is a really nice day, guys. Can't we just, put all of my personal issues to the side for a few hours?" "Yes!" agrees Patton enthusiastically, looking relieved. "Obviously! I mean, you can stick around if you want, but let's all try and keep Thomas calm and happy, all right? There's no reason to get at each other's throats." "Metaphorical or otherwise," Logan adds, with a glance at the drawn weapons. "How very agreeable," hums Janice. "Well, maybe we could fight a bit," Remus says, sounding entirely too innocent, "and I could maybe fit in some maiming while I'm at it." "No fighting, with weapons or otherwise, and definitely no maiming," Thomas begs. "Oh, come on! What's a little brotherly carnage between, brothers?" Remus says enthusiastically, bringing his morning star up from his side. Thomas glances over and sees that Logan's flicking through a handful of flashcards. He pulls one out, scans it, and nods. "The Cain instinct," he says solemnly. "Of course." "I really don't think," Patton says, looking much more nervous than Logan does, but Remus is already charging Roman, who brings his sword up to defend. But before the morning star can so much as contact Roman's body in the least, there's a blur of black and purple, and Virgil is there, heaving Roman bodily out of the way. Remus doesn't even make the slightest attempt to alter his weapon's course, and Virgil goes flying backward up with the impact of the morning star, arms pinwheeling wildly, and goes under with a tremendous splash of water that absolutely soaks everybody standing on the bank. There's a moment as the water stills where everybody seems to be completely frozen. "Oh dear," says Janice, who's leaning lightly on Thomas's shoulder to watch the whole thing, sounding endlessly amused by the whole affair. Patton lets out a tiny, dismayed squeak and stumbles to the edge of water. "Virgil? Virgil?" "Oh my God," breathed Thomas, flat out horrified. "You killed him?" "Nah," said Remus, and holds up his morning star for inspection. It becomes obvious as he shakes it about with one hand that it's not a proper weapon by anyone's standards. In fact, it appears to be made out of rubber, or something else suitably floppy. Janice laughs, a tiny chuckle of amusement, and unwinds himself from Thomas's side even as Virgil breaches the water, coughing and spluttering and cursing. Patton immediately wades in to help him up, although Virgil waves off the attention, stumbling to his feet. He's glaring ferociously enough to burn a hole clean through steel at 15 paces, so it's surprising that Remus is actually still standing, and grinning no less. "Great," he growls. "Now I'm wet." Remus just beams. Roman ends up going in as well to help Virgil out of the water, and out of his soaked-through hoodie, although his protests against this are vehement and probably completely understandable considering it's just as imaginary as the rest of him. Nonetheless, he does end up quieting down into a kind of sullen, reluctantly happy silence, when Roman kisses him cleanly and squarely on the forehead, and declares him his hero for intercepting the death blow. Technically, he was never in anything close to danger, Logan begins, but Thomas and Patton, from either side of him, shush him wholeheartedly, because it's rare to see the two of them getting along. Not as rare as it had been in the past, but it's still a bit of an unexpected delight. Remus, having had his moment of chaos already, seems content enough to follow them as the group as a whole uses a fallen log to hop the river, and continues off into a sunnier part of the woods. Patton's carrying his shoes and socks in one hand, and tiptoeing through the scattered leaves and twigs, yelping softly whenever he steps on them. Virgil is still soaked through, and muttering angrily to himself about how his headphones aren't working anymore, but he brightens as they remerge from the trees and shrubbery into a positively fantastical clearing. It's so legitimately stunning that Thomas has to stop for a moment just to catch his breath. And sure, Remus charges past him to go tear up a patch of delicate-looking flowers and rip them into shreds, but even that can't really ruin it. It's like something out of a fairy tale. The clearing's almost perfectly circular, although it doesn't appear to be man-made in any way, and the regular walking path isn't visible in any direction. The sunlight streams in from above, forming large patches of luxurious-looking warmth on the perfectly green grass. There's flowers and mushrooms and plants and moss everywhere, growing in patches and clusters, and on the sides of trees and rocks, and there's a few birds calling to each other, far up above it all. Not loud enough or insistent enough to be actually annoying, just a pleasant sort of background noise. I don't think I've ever been here before, Thomas says, although he's almost certain he hasn't. He'd remember a place like this. This is ideal, Roman asserts, looking as delighted as Thomas feels. Virgil seems to agree, because he's already heading directly for one of the patches of sunlight, throwing himself down in the grass. He rolls over so the sun's hitting his face, and stretches contentedly in it, cat-like. Janice coos mockingly, clicking his tongue at Virgil even as he plucks a bright yellow flower that Thomas tentatively identifies as a buttercup, and tucks it behind his more reptilian ear. Virgil opens his eyes and gives Janice a very dark look indeed, but instead of saying anything more vitriolic, just says, "I know for a fact that you love lying in the sun as much as I do." "I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about." Janice looks around and pulls a purple flower, which, Thomas has no idea what that one is, from where it's sprouting off the side of a tree. He regards it with a curious expression on his face. Virgil sighs. "Cut the crap and get over here." "Absolutely not," says Janice, already heading over. He drops the tiny purple blossom unceremoniously on Virgil's chest, and settles down on the grass rather elegantly several feet to the left of him in another patch of sunlight. He tips his face upward, and his scales catch in this brilliant light. He looks happy, content. Thomas grins at them both, coexisting without argument, and goes to explore the edges of the clearing. There's so many flowers, just so many. Every species and type of flower that he can name or picture in his head is there in some form, and there's quite a lot that he can't name there as well. He notices something, and knocks his way past a few sunflowers, their dark round faces tilting and bobbing up at the sky. He almost squishes a few perfectly formed red and white mushrooms with one misplaced step before he manages to right himself and take a good look at what he was heading towards. There's clusters of dark, juicy berries hanging from leafy green branches, hanging at just the perfect height for picking. He holds one up to examine it, and he's pretty sure that they're blackberries, but he can't really be sure. And he doesn't need Virgil's sudden intake of breath and warning stare from across the clearing to remind him that eating unknown berries in the middle of the woods probably isn't the best of ideas. "Logan," he calls, "do you think these are edible?" Logan strolls over at an easy amble, peering at the berry clump cradled in Thomas's hand. "You brought snacks from home," he points out, and of course he's right. There's several energy bars and at least one bag of trail mix tucked inside Thomas's backpack, next to his water bottle, and more back at home. "Yes, but," Thomas gives him a pleading look, fresh berries direct from the forest. How often do I get to try those?" Logan sighs and bends forward, pushing his glasses up on his nose and frowning. "It's not as if I have any particular expertise in this area, you know. They certainly appear to be blackberries, but if you feel any particular inclination towards eating them, I'd advise performing a quick internet search and confirming that more in detail." "Gotcha," Thomas says. He tugs his phone out because the berries really do look delicious, and is disappointed to realize that this deep in the forest he's got no reception at all. He sighs. Aw, man. Never mind, I guess. Hey, Lo! Patton says. Thomas looks over, momentarily distracted from his disappointment over the berries. He's jogging lightly across the clearing in their direction. His hands are full of flowers in all shapes and sizes, evidently somewhat roughly torn from the ground, judging by the variety of stem lengths and the missing petals. Do you know how to make flower crowns? I've always wanted to do those. You're popular today, Thomas says happily. Logan straightens up, also looking rather pleased, and says, This I do know. Is a simple form of braiding, actually. Pass me some of those Taraxacum officinale, and I'll show you. Dandelions, says Janice, opening his slitted eye halfway from where he's laying some distance across the clearing. You can just call them dandelions, Logan. It's okay. Logan makes a tiny noise of annoyance and sighs. Pass me some dandelions. Thomas glances around as Patton plops down right next to Logan and begins to mirror Logan's flower weaving with slightly clumsier fingers. He sees that Virgil appears to be dozing lightly in the sunlight, looking genuinely happy and content, and that Roman and Remus appear to be having some kind of tree-climbing competition. Roman seems to be the only one properly engaging in it, because he's determinedly hauling himself up what looks to be the tallest tree in the clearing, while Remus is currently sitting on a very low-hanging branch, hard at work bothering a group of somewhat bemused scrub jays. Thomas waves up at both of them. They both wave back with more or less equal levels of enthusiasm. Remus points animatedly at one of the birds on the branch above him, yelling in earnest amazement, They're so small! I could eat one, just like a marshmallow. Please don't do that, Thomas yells back. Thomas! Roman exclaims, his loud, confident voice carrying perfectly well from this height. I have another one! A song? Thomas calls. Roman nods and gives him a thumbs up. Go for it, buddy! Roman grins, extends his arm heavenwards, and sings out, in a clear, bright tone, with a catchy, cheerful melody. My honey's smile is warm, warm and bright, like a glowing fire. Thomas bounces on his feet, the same excitement and giddiness that he gets when a really excellent idea strikes him from nowhere, filling him from head to toe. Hey, that's great! Is there any more? What's it about? No idea, Roman shouts cheerfully, but it's something, isn't it? Sure is. Keep plugging away at it, buddy. I know you'll get there eventually. Of course, he exclaims, and then gestures down at the bush of berries that Thomas is still standing right next to. And speaking of brilliant ideas, have you considered taking a selection of those delectable-looking treats home with you? If internet connection is the problem, I know for a fact we have plenty of that back at the house. Yes, Thomas says, another bolt of excitement flooding through him. Thanks, Roman. I just need to find something to put them in. He hesitates. Hey, Jan? No, I'm not allowing my hat to end up as a makeshift berry basket, Janice replies, without looking up or even opening his eyes. Not that it would have done you much good anyway, and not to give out any sort of good advice or hints or anything of the sort, but you may want to try looking for a slightly more, substantial receptacle. Good point. Thomas tugs off his backpack and starts hunting through it. Even as he does, he feels a weight land on top of his head, and he yelps in alarm, hands going up to his hair, where something is now resting. He feels petals and leaves, and tugs it off his head, pulling it down to eye level. He smiles when he sees what it is, a wreath made out of flowers of every color, braided in a way that makes it most definitely resemble a rainbow gradient. Sorry, kiddo. Didn't mean to startle you, Patton says from right behind him. Thomas, still examining the intricately woven flower crown, turns around to see that his sense of morality is wearing a considerably less cohesive-looking chain of similarly multicolored flowers that drape all over his head, spilling down off his shoulders and catching in folds of his hoodie. Logan helped me make it. You can take it or leave it. Roman's grin drops slightly for a second. But seriously, I hope you like it, because if you don't, I might start crying. It was so hard to find the right flowers. You have no idea. Aw, it's great, Pat. Don't worry, says Thomas, meaning it completely. He bends his head down slightly so Patton can ruffle his hair and then carefully place the wreath back into place. And as he does, sees that Logan's wearing a flower crown of his own, obviously Patton made by the scattered color scheme and less than accurate weaving. When the crown's in place and Patton's given him the big double thumbs up of approval, Thomas succeeds in tracking down the large-ish Ziploc bag with a loose amount of trail mix rattling around from the bottom of the depths of his backpack. As Logan leans over to hook a crown of sunflowers and begonias over the top of Janice's hat, Roman and Remus come down from the trees to join the gradually forming circle. Roman declares Thomas's crown a suitably gay forest crown for a gay forest king, before going over to help Logan finish making flower crowns for everyone else there, because apparently that's what's happening, while Thomas sets about distributing trail mix so he'll have an empty bag for berry collection purposes. Remus wants mushrooms and poison ivy in his crown. Logan can work out a way to do the former, but point-blank refuses to do the latter, and the resulting wreath is mossy and rotted in appearance, with quite a few spiky and thorny vines thrown in as a compromise. Patton takes most of the chocolate chips and M&Ms, while Virgil is strangely partial to the nuts. Roman has mostly roses in his crown, and likes raisins, and Logan claims all the strange grainy parts of the trail mix that no one else seems to like. A short while later, they're all kind of dozing around on the grass, covered in flowers, and Thomas is so thrilled with this delightful turn of events that he takes a bunch of photos on his phone, which are all technically selfies when you think about it, which none of them actually end up objecting to. Thomas stands up, empty plastic bag in hand, and goes over to load it full of possibly blackberries. There's quite a lot of them, so he at least won't be starved for choice. "Hey, isn't that a fairy ring?" Patton says, propping his chin up with one hand as he gazes over in Thomas's direction. Thomas glances down and sees that, yeah, the mushrooms he had been so carefully avoiding before are in fact part of a larger circular pattern. They're perfect mushrooms, too, the platonic ideal of what a mushroom should be like, bright red with white speckled spots, and they're circling the area he's standing in. It's such a charming sight that he has to take a moment to process it. "You should be careful, Thomas," Roman says, adjusting his flower crown and beaming. "You might end up trapped in there forever if you do something wrong." "Something like picking berries," Remus adds. "Fairy berries!" Virgil actually doesn't voice anything at this, because apparently fairy tales are a step too far for him to be actually anxious about, but his back does tense up a bit. It would be barely noticeable if you didn't know him. Thomas laughs and starts picking berries, placing them carefully in the bag so as not to squish them. Trapped in here forever? That doesn't sound right. He steps back and forth over the edge of the mushroom circle experimentally and waves a hand over the non-existent barrier. "You'd be more likely to end up dancing until your feet fall off," Logan says, if we are alluding to the more classical Irish or British folklore. "Literally?" Remus wonders. "Considering the casual viciousness of the original tales of the Fae, I wouldn't be surprised," he replies, although I really must point out that the so-called fairy rings are often formed by underground fungal abnormalities. "So you're saying the fairies aren't going to erupt out of the earth and drag us down to their underground palace so I can be their fabulous gay consort for now and evermore?" Roman says. "Sad." "All previous circular fungal encounters point to no," says Logan. "Pity," yawns Janice, and takes the flower crown off of his hat. He starts unwinding it carefully until it's one long chain, and then drapes it around his shoulders like a boa, or a particularly floral-looking snake. "I was rather looking forward to that." Thomas is about to raise a light objection, but upon second consideration he finds that he rather likes the idle fantasy. "Nope, actually that does sound pretty neat. Fairies, take me away." "Any fairy would be lucky to have us," Roman agrees happily. Thomas finishes picking the berries in a matter of minutes and stows the bag carefully in his backpack before glancing up at the sky. The sun's lowering already. It's not exactly getting late, but he knows it's definitely about time he started heading back. He kind of wants to make it home before sunset. It's not like he actually has anything on tonight, but he doesn't really feel like wandering through the forest or driving back while it's dark. The sides help gather up anything that they've brought along or left on the ground. There's not much to speak of, and with the entire group trailing a lot more flower petals than they'd entered the forest with, Logan navigates them back to the main path, and from there all the way back to the parking lot. "You know what?" says Virgil, as they all pile somewhat awkwardly into Thomas's tiny car. "This has been a good day." He audibly struggles for a moment before adding, "I'm glad we did this." "Me too," Thomas says, watching Janice and Patton bicker softly over who's taking the middle seat through the rear view mirror. "Thanks for coming, guys. It wouldn't be nearly as fun without you." "It's not as if we could not come," Logan points out. He had called shotgun, with the aid of one of his vocabulary cards, and is now busy programming the route home into Thomas's phone. "But, nonetheless, yes, a very pleasant and healthy outing all in all." The drive home is uneventful, apart from the fact that Remus is clinging to the roof of the car and screaming at the top of his lungs for almost the whole trip. Whether it's in delight or something else, it's very hard to tell. Thomas desperately hopes that this is one of those side-related things that most people just don't pay attention to, but he can never really be sure until he gets that fateful call from the police. Upon unlocking the house and heading inside, Janice, Patton, and the twins sink away into the depths of Thomas's mind. Virgil curls up on the couch, looking kind of worn out, and Logan starts putting away the contents of his bag, reminding him to get a start on dinner. "First things first," said Thomas, and goes to search up the identity of his berries. A quick Google and a few comparisons confirm that, yes, the dark berries in his bag do appear to be blackberries. He hesitantly nibbles at the corner of one to double-check, and the slightly familiar taste explodes in his mouth. He can't help but gobble a few more down, because they're delicious. Perfectly sweet and juicy, and even the fact that they're slightly warm from the insulation of his backpack and the car trip back can't ruin that. Inspiration strikes suddenly. "Logan! Hey, Logan, do you think I can make a pie out of these?" "Have you ever made a pie before?" Virgil says from the couch, and then, "Don't answer that. I know you haven't. This can only end badly." Logan's already in the kitchen, opening drawers and cupboards. Pie crust generally requires flour, salt, sugar, and butter, all of which you have here, he says. "I don't see why not. You'll never know if you don't try." "You'll make a mess," says Virgil. "Also, you're tired. Is it really worth the effort?" For a second, Thomas is swayed from the initial allure of fresh pie, but then his resolve hardens. "If I make a mess, I make a mess," he decides. "I think I'm going to do this. Don't you want pie?" Virgil looks unconvinced, so Thomas presses further. "I'll let you choose the cooking music." "Ugh, fine." Thomas switches on Spotify on his phone and pulls up the very first blackberry pie recipe he can find on his computer. Virgil snatches up the phone and starts scrolling through their extensive list of playlists, eventually settling on his own. Even as Thomas begins to assemble the crust ingredients, the soft sounds of lo-fi hip-hop spills out into the kitchen. The sky is beginning to fade into twilight outside, and the lights inside are soft and warm. Virgil crawls up to sit on the counter next to Thomas, keeping a vigilant eye on the oven, as Thomas mixes the ingredients vigorously in a large bowl, wishing he actually had an apron. He'll have to buy one next time he's in, well, a place that sells aprons. Logan switches the oven on to preheat, because he's sensible and the backbone of the kitchen in general, and they'd never get anything done without him. And Thomas starts rolling out the dough onto a countertop that's dusted lightly with flour. Roman strolls in through the door at this point and declares he's obviously the best person to assemble the pie crust, seeing as it's going to take immense skill to get it looking absolutely perfect. Thomas shuffles over to leave him to it and starts puzzling out the pie filling. Half an hour, and a lot of splattered berries and cursing, later, the pie goes into the oven, as does a pre-made pizza that Thomas unearths from his freezer, and at Logan's prodding, he throws together a hasty salad from the lettuce and tomatoes and carrots lying around in his fridge. And by the time he and Logan and Roman have finished cleaning up the pie-related mess, Virgil's still keeping an eye near compulsively on the timers in the oven, the food is golden brown and smelling fantastic. "You've got a bottle of wine here," says Janice, who's suddenly at the cupboard and digging through it. "Aren't you saving that for a special occasion?" Patton says, peering around the corner of the kitchen. "You might need it later, if your friends come around or something." "Nah." Thomas tosses the oven mitt he'd used to tug the pizza out sideways, and Janice catches it easily with a sideways smirk. "Tonight's pretty special already. Let's make it better." He takes the wine from Janice's offering grasp, with a nod and a smile, and moves the pizza and salad into the living room to eat on the couch. Dinner is pleasant. Everyone shows up, even Remus, and are more or less civil to each other. None of the sides actually eat, apparently full of snack food from their impromptu picnic, although Patton does try and steal a slice or two of his pizza. Conversation is as easy and light as it had been in the forest, and by the time Thomas goes to retrieve the pie from the oven, he's made his way through 1.5 glasses of wine and is feeling light and bubbly and a little tipsy. The pie is a little burnt around the edges and slightly lopsided, despite Roman's best efforts. But it's delicious. It hadn't needed much sugar at all, and the blackberries remain perfectly juicy and sweet, even when hot. Thomas polishes off 2 slices before Virgil starts to nag him gently about calories, and he decides to clear up the food and dishes, and then have a shower, maybe watch an episode or 2 of The Office before calling it a night. And that's just what he does. In fact, he's in his pajamas and in bed by 9:30, which is downright incredible by his standards. It's been a long day, but he's happily exhausted, and strangely satisfied with his mental health. And when he wakes up tomorrow, he's going to get on his work. And that's definitely not a lie. Thank you very much, Janice. Good night, guys, he calls out, and receives a chorus of sleepy good-night wishes in response. He grins into the darkness, knowing that the reassuring solid figures of his fractalized personality will be there if he needs them. He's asleep before he even realizes he's drifting, and he's happy.